I am both amazed and incredibly thankful to you all for getting me to 1,000 subs. I never believed for a moment when I started that this was even a possibility for me, considering what I talk about and my opinion on most things. That being said, I have decided to throw all of this away by talking about this movie, Vampire Clay. It's a story of a small class of art students out in the boonies of a rural Japanese town. Tensions are running high as the exams to a prestigious art school in Tokyo are approaching, and the students and teacher don't know if they're ready, but it won't matter if none of them make it to the exam. I know most of you don't hang around to the end of these videos, and I don't blame you, but I am going to get the spoiler-free review out of the way and then go into the kind of play-by-play. Vampire Clay is an incredibly honest and eager movie, and depending on what you're looking for in a horror movie, this is either great or a huge red flag. The poster looks like something you would see in an 80s video store next to things like The Puppet Master or Evil Toys. It reeks of 80s schlock, and it has the tagline, "Art so bad it kills," like a Goosebumps book cover. You pick up the box and read the back, and it's a movie about an evil clay doll that's terrorizing people. You pause and think to yourself, is this really what I want to waste my one weekend rental on? Yeah. And you will have no regrets that weekend. Vampire Clay has all the trademarks that you could look for. Weirdly bad but somehow entertaining stop motion, needless gore, and an absurd yet dramatic plot. It would be almost funny how ridiculous this movie was if it weren't for the fact that the movie doesn't seem to be aware or snarky about what it is. Like the original Puppet Master or the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, it reaches points of straight ridiculousness, but it never loses the dangerous feeling because it never acknowledges how ridiculous it is. It's also a pleasant surprise when I pick up one of these expecting a good drinking film and instead just find a great movie to watch. I recommend it if you're a big fan of old style horror movies, but if you're looking for something more serious or plausible, then yeah, this probably isn't for you. Now that that's done, let's go over the whole thing. The movie starts with a small art class out in the countryside of Japan called the Aina Academy. A recent earthquake has altered the ground around it, revealing a sealed box of clay just outside the classroom. As one of the students, Kaori, returns from a brief time in a bigger class in Tokyo, seemingly to the annoyance of her classmate Reiko, who has also given Kaori's clay to a new student named Yuka, forcing Kaori to instead use the clay that was dug up that morning. They have their first art project in which Kaori and Reiko tie, which further irritates Reiko, and in their off time afterwards, as Kaori is talking with the other girls about whether or not she's any better for having spent time in a bigger classroom in Tokyo, Reiko angrily sharpens her pencil until she chips a blade and places it on the side. That night, the insofar unaware cursed clay takes the broken piece of the blade and hides it inside itself, forcing Kaori to nick her finger as she comes into class the next day. She ends up spilling her blood on the clay, and while clearly suspecting Reiko of having put the blade in there, she says nothing. An argument breaks out between the students and the teacher about whether or not they're big enough to keep improving. The students want more teachers from bigger cities like Tokyo to come in and help them, but the teacher is hesitant as she has a flashback to an incident that occurred when she was a teacher in the Tokyo school. It's not really well explained visually, at least not to me, but from what I can piece together, Aina was seeing one of the other teachers while she was teaching in Tokyo, and then found out he was having a relationship with a student, and she just kind of left to start her own school away from the city and all of the people there. Once the argument is done, Reiko goes back to work long after everyone else has left and ends up bleeding onto the cursed clay head. And here's where the fun really begins. I can honestly say I was pretty on the fence on the movie up to this point. It started out pretty slow and I was already struggling to follow it because I couldn't find it with English subtitles and my Japanese is worse than a preschooler's. But this sequence, this segment immediately turned me around on it. The way the head just grabs onto her hand and begins to consume her while she tries to fight it off. The completely unnecessary part of making a clay mouse to keep her quiet by crawling into her mouth. And I have it on surprisingly good authority that if you watch this scene on speaker and the people who live with you don't know what you're watching, it sounds extremely pornographic. It's everything I've ever wanted from a movie like this. She does finally manage to get herself free by burning the head so that it hardens and releases her, and then tries to call 911 on her phone, but finds that her hand has been turned into clay as well. As she begins freaking out about it, her hand morphs into its own giant clay mouth and begins to consume herself. Like, just look at this. I really wish that I could just present silent, unedited moments so that you could just enjoy this movie. But YouTube, right? I cannot describe how great it is. I really hope you watch this movie. It's definitely the best thing I've seen so far working on this channel, and it's somehow gonna get even cooler as the movie goes on. The next morning, the students do come back to the class to find Kaori's sculpture just damaged and mutilated, and discuss that they do believe Reiko to be responsible for it, which she argues against, unaware that she is trapped in the clay head and cannot be heard. Kaori sits down and, a little angry, just starts tearing away at the head, destroying Reiko from the inside. The clay does reform into Reiko though and attacks Yuka outside, cutting her hand and drinking her blood, thus turning her into clay, I guess. There's a cool little moment of clay Yuka seemingly like assimilating with the clay on her table while she's trying to blend in as the class is going, but it quickly returns to normal in time for her to attack Kanji in the back room and take his form. Believe it or not, here, with almost 30 minutes left in the movie, the final fight will begin. Clay Kanji begins his attack on Aiko and doesn't do very well for himself, all things considered. I was gonna try to recap the entire encounter, but honestly that would just kind of take away from a lot of how great it is. So I'm just gonna hit the highlights and hope that it makes you want to watch it. I never want to be a replacement for watching the original product, but there's a pretty good amount of highlights in here too, so it'll be alright. The first comes in as he chases Aiko into a back room where she cuts off his arm with the door, and the arm begins to operate on its own, which is pretty standard fare for horror movies. It's just kind of neat to watch the bone turn to clay and begin reaching out to her. The stop motion in this is never very cutting edge or amazing, but it is good. It's neat to watch, and I like how much they've put into it. Aiko does manage to go on the offensive and jam a large, I don't know what this is. It's a protractor, maybe? She jams it into his face, and he just starts using his face as a weapon instead. She just headbangs at her, trying to cut her with the thing in his face. It's great. And when Yuri arrives to help, she ends up caving his head in with a fucking bento box, revealing that he is entirely made of clay and he can be beat. They end up crushing him with a board, trying to flatten him out, which doesn't work because he just changes his form into these sentient tentacles reaching up through the board trying to reach at them. No matter how much damage they try to inflict, he just keeps changing and adapting, and it never seems to work. It begins to seem hopeless until a random homeless man who showed up literally once or twice in passing scenes throughout the movie just breaks into the building and uses some kind of high-powered heat dryer to burn Kanji into hardened clay, allowing the others to crush it back into the dust. He begins to explain where the evil doll came from, and it's a very long and honestly well done story, but I'm going to cut it a little short. The homeless man who came in used to be an entrepreneur who offered a struggling artist named Mitazuka, who had been growing ill due to toxins around his home, but desperately wanted to go to Tokyo, the opportunity to sell his sculptures to restaurants and have them put on display. So Mitazuka, inspired by all the money and the fulfillment of his dreams that's coming, goes on a sculpting spree until he realizes that his illness will defeat him and he will not make it to Tokyo. Instead, he creates one final sculpture, seeming to even use his own blood in the shaping of it to create Kakane to go to the city in his stead. When he speaks to the homeless man again, named Fushimi, by the way. He learns that Fushimi has cheated him out of his money, and the two start fighting, which ends in Mitazuka's death. Fushimi blames himself and begins drinking constantly, while the illness apparently turned Mitazuka's bones into dust, which Fushimi spills alcohol onto, awakening the evil clay spirit Kakame. After explaining all of this, they gather the dust to bury it deep underground again, but accidentally spill some liquid on it, awakening the clay to consume Kaori. This is one of the great things about movies like this, that the main girl can and pretty often does die. And it's not always for a good reason. Sometimes like this, it just happens. Round 2 begins as Kaori attacks Aiko and does manage to wound her. Fushimi does interrupt again though, once again drying her body out and destroying it. They are all finally aware that you need to keep the dirt away from any form of liquid whatsoever. And it seems like it's finally over until a sudden earthquake stirs the dust into the air and Fushimi inhales some of it, allowing Kakame to reform inside of his body and erupt out alien style to continue his attack. I cannot emphasize how much I love this movie. Aiko cuts herself to distract Kakame from Yuri, and the doll grows to this enormous size in order to seemingly swallow her whole. This whole movie is about clay consuming people. I'm sure if you really wanted to, there's an argument for the whole obsession with art consuming one's being, but I don't like to think about that. Look at it. It's great. As he bears down on Aiko, Yuri stabs him from behind, and the two of them with pretty different tools just repeatedly stab it. I can honestly say that I do not understand the acid trip stop motion adventure that begins at this point of the movie that apparently causes Kakame to burst into flame. But it does end with this awesome shot of him pinned to the wall, burning away from the inside, seemingly defeating him once and for all. I love the design of Kakame, by the way. I desperately want one of these for my place, but the missus is adamant that she will not allow this into our home, which frankly sucks, but I love this. We jump ahead in time a little bit as Yuri and Aiko stand in front of a building holding a box presumably filled with Kakame's remains. They have a completely silent, wordless debate about whether or not to leave it at the building they are at, which is revealed to be the Tokyo art school that Kaori visited. After a few back and forths, they cannot bring themselves to inflict that hell upon someone else, and decide instead to encase the remains in concrete and bury it in the forest. Unfortunately, as time passes, earthquakes and Mother Nature itself just wear away at the concrete and the remains eventually become wet, and Kakame returns in a monstrous form containing all of the faces of the students he killed, and he entwines himself with the roots around him, eventually bringing down the buildings of a nearby city as we fade to black. I love this movie. It is exactly what I wanted it to be. A fun time that doesn't spend too much time, or any time at all, poking fun at itself. I've gotten really tired of things becoming meta commentaries on themselves. It was fun and unique when things like Scream did it, but Scream also knew that it had to be a good movie on its own, while winking and nodding at the genre. While most movies just seem to hang their hats on their self-awareness and sometimes even seem ashamed of where they come from or the genre that they are in, Vampire Clay never laughs at its own nonsense, but plays it entirely straight and keeps a consistent tone. You can argue that its effects look bad or cheap, and maybe that's true, but it's never been a real problem for me, so I can get past it. If you think it won't bother you, and some of the clips that you've seen here seem interesting to you, I encourage you to check it out. It is available right now with English subtitles on Amazon Prime. And if you don't have Amazon Prime, it is weirdly difficult to find on less legitimate websites. But it can be found, and I encourage you to go looking for it. That's going to be it for me this time. But I have already decided the next movie, and I'm going to record it today, so I'll be back sooner than you think. So as always, whether you